My name is Frank Urena. I'm a Principal Architect with Oxford Computer Group. And today we're going to be discussing the topic of getting the most out of your Microsoft 365 investment. We're going to specifically be talking about uh, Microsoft 365, the E5 licensing SKU, which could also be if you're in academia, it would be an A5, or in government, a G5. Essentially all the same. There might be some subtle differences between uh, those different verticals, but for the most part, talking about the entitlements within E5, which is the kind of top tier where Microsoft is throwing in a lot of value uh, in that SKU. Our agenda is going to be a kind of brief discussion of the best-in-class versus the integrated approach, which we'll see is really where the industry is moving, especially in security. And then talk about streamlining and strengthening with Microsoft security, essentially the case for Microsoft. We are a Microsoft partner. I'll get into that in our next slide a little bit, what we do. But we are a Microsoft partner, have been a Microsoft partner for many, many years. So we understand the Microsoft security story. We understand how it integrates. And essentially this is making that case for why consolidate with Microsoft 365 security, how it improves the user experience and security overall and reduces cyber risk with an integrated best-in-class security product. Briefly about us, Oxford Computer Group, for those that may not know, we have over 20 years experience specifically around identity and access management. If you mention the name Oxford Computer Group, we may be referred to as the MIM guys or FIM guys. That's Forefront Identity Manager and Microsoft Identity Manager, which is the current product, because we essentially wrote the book and the training on Microsoft Identity Manager and have done hundreds of implementations over the past 20 years or so as the product itself evolved when it was first purchased by Microsoft way back in, I believe, 2000. But since then, we have also evolved as Microsoft product landscape has and identity and access management has. So we do a lot of our work now with identity and access management and identity governance in the cloud with Azure Active Directory. One of our other main partners is Savient for identity governance. And then we also do team up with a few other partners for privileged access management and a couple other security SKUs, but for the most part have been a Microsoft partner through and through and have deep relationships with those engineering teams. So just to begin, when we're talking about defending against cyber attacks, uh, one thing that has to be considered is that growing complexity of the digital estate that you as practitioners have to manage. When you think about your assets, what do you think about? What are you defending against, right? Used to be where, 15, 20 years ago, with everything being primarily on premise, you had servers, you had endpoint devices that for the most part did not leave the perimeter all that often. A lot of it was desktop computers that stayed put behind the firewalls. Yeah, you probably had some laptops that you managed for a set number of users, but you can rely on your VPN to ensure secure connectivity back to the central location, again, behind those firewalls. Of course, the landscape has changed, right? There's mobile devices that companies had to issue and then manage to their users. Then there's, of course, personally owned devices, the BYOD, which a lot of organizations started to adopt more and more because it just made sense to uh, uh, realize the savings of not having to purchase iOS and Android devices on a continuous basis. Just let users use what they already have, but find ways to protect those. There's of course IoT devices now in manufacturing, OT devices. Essentially, by some accounts, 7 billion different internet connected devices worldwide, which doesn't even include laptops and mobile devices, right? All the smart appliances and cameras and everything else out there that is connecting into our environment. So with all these changes, of course, the game has changed when it comes to security. Um, we no longer have the luxury of drawing our perimeters around our organizations, or the castle and moat approach, right? Because it's all out in the cloud. Cloud adoption is here to stay, and so security has had to adjust for that. And so, taken all together, all these trends, we see that there's quite a challenge to IT security. But that's where Microsoft provides a way forward. Microsoft, trusted public cloud, uniquely suited for this challenge due to its simplicity, speed, and scale. So we'll talk about Microsoft's approach to cybersecurity from a product perspective versus what we've traditionally done for a long time, which is that best-in-class approach. That process usually looks like this, right? You are given a mandate to find solution X to solve problem Y. So you begin gathering your requirements. You go through an RFI or RFP process, send it out to bidders, get those back, um, you know, compile those answers, aggregate them, find which ones you have your weights that are important to you, what you're trying to accomplish. Perhaps have a couple of POCs or bake-offs. Uh, in the meantime, choose the best one and then move forward from there. Of course, that process has had its benefits, right? It's highly customizable. Those products that you're selecting, because they are specific to solving that particular problem, are going to be robust. They're going to be enterprise ready. Uh, they may have some additional functionality that you didn't think of, but it's kind of thrown in, and you can take advantage of that. Some might be for a little extra uh, cost, some add-ons that you will need to bolt on to that solution. But ultimately, you have a higher degree of assurance that that solution is going to meet that business need. And then you can have rapid deployment, because again, it's a purpose-built solution to solve that problem. There's not a lot of integration points. But then, of course, there's disadvantages. There is the cost. Usually for those specific solutions, they charge a premium because they are good at what they do, so they're not going to give it away for free necessarily. Um, from a procurement standpoint, procurement teams that we talk to, we see that this is uh, an issue. Just multiple contracts, complex life cycles, different contract end dates. You're trying to align all that together, keeping on top of it could be a challenge. And then there's, from a security perspective, of course, there's the gaps in those products that don't necessarily talk to each other. And that, there's good argument saying that they should have tighter integration to be able to detect cybersecurity risks in an environment more quickly, more efficiently, and being able to isolate attacks more consistently. And there's so many vendors. When I first did this talk, this was a couple years ago, so I've had the opportunity in preparing for this presentation today to update some of these. These are some of the vendors that were available, different products. Since then, there's been a lot of consolidation, right? Centrify and Psychotic, for instance, are now Delinea. Of course, VMware bought Carbon Black, and VMware has since been is part of the Dell family. There's just that constant kind of churn with that, and that's because the industry and the marketplace has seen a need to move toward this best of suite approach. So that's why you see, vendors continue to buy up smaller providers and incorporate them into their solutions because of that, because because of cloud and because of wanting to provide their customers with a complete solution, um, they're buying smaller players, integrating them into their products. This was a Forrester approach analysis in 2019 that acquisition activity was just going to keep increasing. Of course, since then, that has held up. Certainly true. And that's because they're trying to build out their cybersecurity portfolios to have these complete solutions. The integrated platform, unlike the best of breed or best in class, takes that SAP approach. SAP, this ERP solution that can do um, vendor management and product management and finance, all kind of with these different modules that you can bolt together, but they all, because they're part of the same product, all can talk to each other. That's that best in suite approach. What we call the SAP approach, where you can leverage as much as you can from a single source. You get integration of various components, which is typically easier. It's a common user interface, right? You don't have to go to different portals, different tools, have different applications open to be able to gather the information that you need. And it's a consistent architecture approach. And so that leads us into the Microsoft 365 E5 SKU, an integrated platform. And before we begin, I just have a poll question that I'd like to get everyone's take on, because we often, in talking to customers and as a consultancy, we talk to a lot of different customers, and the Microsoft teams come to us too, because they're seeing it as well, where their customers are just not aware of what they have access to, what they are entitled to. So we just want to get a feel for the audience. And are you aware of what's in your entitlement, what you're paying for? So let's see, that majority of everyone voting. We're seeing 80% say we're using about 25% of the capabilities, and only 20% saying we're using almost all the capabilities. So that kind of aligns with what we're seeing pretty consistently out there, that many people just don't understand. That's probably, I'm going to say, it's probably Microsoft's fault, because there has been some confusion. It takes a lot to understand what's in a SKU these days, but I'm going to pitch a tool that's out there. This is something that I personally found really helpful. This is where I get some of this information. So let's talk about first what Microsoft 365 E5 is, right? It's essentially, we started off, go back 10 years or so to the early 2010s. Company might have purchased Office 365. Office 365 now, has an E5 SKU. What you see on the screen is everything you get with Office 365 E5, right? Besides just Exchange Online, SharePoint, Teams, right? There's of course a number of other features. If you have E5, for instance, you have Defender for Office 365 Plan 2, right? Which has advanced, phishing detection, anti-malware detection, attack simulation training software that you can leverage. There's, of course, you have Office 365 apps, right? All of your favorite apps come bundled with that. You have the ability to leverage some of the cloud app security features specifically around Office 365, right? A lot of stuff that's thrown in there. Then fast forward to about 2015, 2016, and that's when enterprise mobility and security was introduced. EMS, of course, one of the bigger parts of EMS was Intune, right, for endpoint management, unified endpoint management, and Azure Active Directory. So everything in the lighter blue here was everything you get with Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 1, which was part of EMS Security E3. Then if you have E5, you're basically looking at the items here in dark blue, right? So things like access reviews and entitlement management, privilege identity management, which we'll talk about, in more detail, identity protection, risk-based conditional access uh, are what's layered on top of that. And then you also get the dark green here, Defender for Cloud Apps, which is a CASB solution for um, pretty much your entire digital landscape, beyond just Office 365. Defender for Identity, which started its life as Advanced Threat Analytics, which is an on-premise tool. As you can see here, it is retiring. So if you're still using Advanced Threat Analytics, and you have E5, now's the time to start that migration to Defender for Identity. Defender for Identity is all about on-premise detection. It integrates into Active Directory, can detect things like DNS reconnaissance and pass the hash attacks, um, privilege escalation, lateral movement through the environment. That's essentially everything you get with the Defender for Identity. And then there's some advanced or enhanced capabilities within Azure Information Protection, which is all part of the compliance and data loss prevention um, parts of the suite. And so the third component that makes up 365 is everything within Windows, right? So if you have Windows Enterprise E3, everything down here in this lighter shade of green, things like always on VPN, Credential Guard, here, you have BitLocker. That's all part of that Windows SKU. Layered on top of that is Defender for Endpoint Plan 2, which is what you get in the E5. So taking all three of those parts together, what you end up with is Microsoft 365 E5 step up, right? All of those three areas put together in a nice, neat package, where you have your Azure AD Premium Plan 2 for Azure AD, you have your Defender for Office 365 Plan 2, you have your Defender for Endpoint Plan 2, and then there are, of course, some of the workloads around compliance, which is now part of the Purview. So if you see Microsoft Purview, that's just a brand name for what's under the compliance brand, and everything within Microsoft 365 security. All of this information, by the way, it's a little bit hard to see here. I'm going to zoom in just so you can see the name, but you see that M365maps.com, great tool. This is my personal endorsement. Oxford has no affiliation with the individual who put this together, but they deserve a medal because they made a tool to make it really easy for everyone to kind of understand what's in all these different SKUs. So I just recommend, if you haven't, are not aware of it, to take a look at that and keep it bookmarked, because it does come in handy. And apparently, the individual who puts this together, updates it on a regular basis. This is as of March 2023. So what about Entra? You might have heard about Entra. Where does that figure in? Well, Entra itself, again, is another, I'll call it a brand. It really is not a new product. Entra itself, the brand, is comprised of these 5 different workloads. Azure Active Directory being sort of the principal part of that, what Microsoft calls their hero product of Entra. And that, of course, is going to be included. Let me just highlight here. So the Azure Active Directory and the Entra Identity Governance components are all part of your Azure Active Directory Premium SKU, which is rolled up into that Microsoft 365 E5 SKU, right? So the stuff that's in here and in here, all capabilities are part of that. What's not part of it is permissions management, which is a solution. It was an acquisition in 2019, no, actually 2021, I'm sorry, a company called CloudKnox that Microsoft purchased and incorporated into their solution stack. But essentially it's for multi-cloud environments. So if you're running Azure, if you're running AWS, you're running Google Cloud, and you want to get a handle on things like permissions creep, but just get good reporting around where the various roles, who has the roles, who's entitled to the roles, are they over permissioned, things like that. That's where permissions management is going to solve that problem. Then there's Entra Verified ID, which is for kind of decentralized identities. And then Entra Workload Identities, which is a solution around digital workloads such as apps and services, being able to have Azure manage those identities. Think of it like group managed service accounts, but in the cloud, right? Where you don't have to worry about passwords, you don't have to worry about password rotation for these service accounts. These workload identities can work with your apps, work with, for instance, Azure Key Vault to access secrets and certificates in a more secure manner. So we're not going to focus on these workloads here, because again, they're outside of the 365, Microsoft 365 SKU, but of course, Azure Active Directory and identity governance would be part of that. So how can Microsoft help? All right, or why can Microsoft help in this way? Well, first and foremost, it's all about, we talk about efficiencies. We started off talking about the digital landscape, how things have changed, especially, pandemic 2020, everyone went to work from home. For the most part, that's still the status quo. Yeah, there has been some return to the office, but the workforce is mobile and is remote. And so we've had to adapt to that. The Microsoft security suite of products, essentially, as you see on the screen here, right, it's kind of these key areas, these 5 key areas: identity and access management, all part of Azure Active Directory and identity governance, right? Threat protection, part of the Defender suite, endpoint management, now Intune, and yes, it was Intune, then it became Endpoint Manager. It's now back to being called Intune. But endpoint management, all about managing not just your traditional mobile devices, iOS and Android devices, but also your laptops, your Windows-based laptops. Data protection, this is kind of falls under that Microsoft Purview umbrella. So everything that's data loss prevention, information protection, labeling, classification of documents, and then cloud security, which is going to be Defender for Cloud Apps, the Cloud Access Security Broker solution, Defender for Cloud, that falls under the Cloud Security Posture Management. Again, multi-cloud environments, if you want to be able to see how your IaaS devices are configured, if there's any vulnerabilities, if you're trying to map to specific regulatory requirements, such as any of the ISO standards, SOC 2, right? You can, or HIPAA, right? You can set up templates to be able to look at your devices, your databases that are running in not only Azure, but also multi-cloud. So these can reach out to AWS and GCP and give you a nice rolled up view of your cloud resources and assets, and are they compliant? That's kind of where these 40 different disparate products, as it says here, all can be consolidated with Microsoft 365 security. Take this for what it is. This is publicly available. It's on the Microsoft site. I literally just grabbed it today, threw it in here. A couple years ago, the number here was about $30 for multiple vendors per user, and it was $12 for the E5 security add-on. Now obviously has gone up. It's now $24 per user if you add on the compliance and security E5 SKU to, let's say you just have Microsoft 365 E3 and you want to get some of those capabilities around E5. That's what it's going to cost you. But if you have multiple vendors kind of doing the same thing, you're looking at $63 per user. So the thought here is that potentially up to 60% saving by consolidating with Microsoft security. If there's any concern about, well, where does Microsoft stack up against these other providers, right? The Gartner Magic Quadrant, so some of these values here, these are from 2019, so I'm gonna put these up first because I thought it was interesting just to see how it has changed. So in these 5 key areas: access management, cloud access security brokers, enterprise information archiving, endpoint protection, and unified endpoint management, Microsoft was considered a leader back in 2019. Interesting that now Um, in 2022, right, so these are the updated ones. What I found interesting is that, again, because of that consolidation, right, so some of the providers have fallen off because they've either been bought out or merged with another entity, um, or they've just fallen out of, that magic quadrant, the leader space, for a variety of reasons. But main point here is that Microsoft is still considered a leader in these 5 key areas, uh, of security tools. Um, Interesting to note too that cloud access security brokers officially, this is from 2020, because that category Gartner has dropped in favor of what they're calling secure service edge. And you might see, or probably have started seeing, that acronym thrown around more, either SSE or SASE, secure access service edge, new kind of class of products that are really where, again, everything is moving towards as part of the zero trust network access effort, right? Because everybody is mobile, everybody's remote. Firewalls really are not going to be the best line of defense any further, so it's moved towards these zero trust network access providers. Um, so if you're looking for cloud access security brokers, the latest one you'll see is 2021. But everything again has moved toward that secure service edge. Okay, so benefits of Microsoft security native capabilities, right? You get fewer vendors and products to manage. I mean, the products are kind of still their own thing, but for instance, with Defender now, Microsoft Defender, you do have a single console, right? All the previous consoles that we might have had to go to, if you had cloud app security, there was a console. If you wanted information protection or compliance, there was a console. You're using Azure AD, there is a console. That has all nicely been rolled up into security.microsoft.com, which is the Microsoft 365 Defender console, right? So you do have a single area where your SecOps teams can go to, to do their daily tasks. And the results of that, of course, is less end user friction and resistance, right? Ultimately, we want to make security as easy as possible, at least from an end user perspective, because if you make it hard, they're gonna find ways around it. There's lower integration costs, and you get those reduced blind spots, which we'll get into a little bit as well. I do see some questions. Looks like they've been answered. Yeah, so if there was questions regarding the presentation, yes, those will be made available. All right, so let's spend a few minutes talk about delivering seamless end user experience, because that ultimately is, one of the main goals, right? To make everything secure, but also make it as frictionless as possible for your end users, so that they don't find ways around it. They don't adopt a shadow IT approach, where they could just go out and buy a service now, because SaaS is so ubiquitous and so easy to get to. You just buy a SaaS solution because IT said I can't use Dropbox. Well, I'll show them. I'm just going to go buy my own subscription because that's what I need to use. So that's ultimately how we want to improve the end user experiences. Some basic statistics, right? 80% of breaches involve the use of lost or stolen passwords. 60% of BYO devices are not secured by IT. And I mean, that's the way it kind of should be. This number should be higher to a certain degree, right? Corporate IT does not want to be responsible for an end user's personal device. They don't want to be responsible for accidentally wiping out that device because there was non-compliance found on it, because it was being managed as a fully managed as a mobile device management solution. And so we'll talk about how Intune can help in that regard. But also 34% of data breaches are caused by insider threats. Right? So having to guard not just from the outside, but also what's happening within the organization itself. Of course, very glaring example of that is more recently with the Air National Guardsmen who took documents and basically uploaded them to a public Discord server. That was an insider threat. So these are some of the things that keep us up at night as security practitioners. That seamless end user experience, right? So the goal is to enhance productivity while strengthening security, provide flexible and integrated user experiences, and leverage built-in seamless security to protect your data. So let's see how Microsoft can do that. Any given day, this is kind of the typical day in the life for a user today. They may have more than 5 passwords reused on all of their accounts. Big problem. 49% of employees prefer BYOD. I'm one of those. Anywhere I go, I like to have one device. I don't want to have to be walking around with 2 or more mobile devices. And I'm sure that's been, you've seen that your experience as well. But I still want to be able to access my work email and other digital assets from my mobile devices. There are 35 plus apps used on a daily basis, give or take, because of the environment. And 72% of employees regularly share sensitive information, right? So they're working with confidential information. So Microsoft 365 can, of course, help in that regard in a number of ways. First of all, self-service password reset. If you have not taken advantage of self-service password reset, and this is not even a E5 entitlement, it's part of Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 1, which is part of E3. So if you have E3, you can begin doing self-service password reset. If you have been, let's say you've been using FIM or MIM on premise and using the self-service password reset capabilities of MIM, or you have some other solution on-prem, here you have a cloud-based self-service password reset solution that can provide password write back to Active Directory. Many are still using Active Directory as a primary identity provider on premise. That's where all the identities get provisioned first, and then you're synchronizing up into Azure Active Directory. But you can still leverage self-service password reset to keep this identity synchronized across both cloud and on-premise. And it's pretty easy to set up. But again, it's not a specific to E5, it's part of your E3 entitlement. Same with multi-factor authentication. And I'm only bringing this out here because it kind of bears repeating. If you've not deployed MFA, please begin doing so. We know today your password doesn't matter. That was a great blog post by Alex Weiner, who's the director of security for Microsoft a couple years ago. Basically showed the statistics from the signals that Microsoft receives that attackers use various methods to breach accounts for account takeover, and a lot of times it's easy because users are using weak passwords or they're reusing passwords that have been already found on other data breaches, and so it makes it a lot easier for them to do credential stuffing and password spray attacks. That self-service password reset, of course, can aid, reduce the time for users to legitimately get back in, if they've been locked out or if they, if their identity has been detected as part of a breach. They can easily reset their own passwords, reduce those help desk costs. Ultimately, the goal is to move towards passwordless, which with Microsoft 365, with Windows Hello for Business, for instance, which supports inherently using biometrics, like Face ID and fingerprint scanning, is 2-factor. If you're leveraging Windows Hello for Business, that's inherently a 2-factor solution because it is the thing you have, which is the device, the laptop, the thing you are, your face, your fingerprint, or in some cases, the thing it could be just a pin. That pin only works on that device, right? Never leaves. There's not a shared secret. It's going over the wire. It's stored on that TPM chip on that device and only accessed through that mechanism. Or it could be a FIDO2 security key as well. You have Ubico keys or Fishan keys, any of these other providers which Microsoft supports. You can leverage that as part of your passwordless strategy. Unified management. So this is where Intune comes in. Okay, so again, Intune, not specifically an E5, it is part of E3. It's part of that EMS solution that we saw earlier, right? That was kind of rolled up into Microsoft 365 E5. But if you haven't deployed Intune, if you're still using a third-party MDM solution, maybe it's time to really give Intune a look. We are getting requests, and this is my own anecdotal evidence, but our customers are contacting us saying, yeah, we have solution X, but we own Intune, we want to migrate. And we do a lot of those migration projects with our customers to help them to get off that third-party solution and start leveraging Intune because of that really nice integration. Now, this is not to say that if you're running, let's say, AirWatch or Mobile Iron, those providers have made APIs available so that, for instance, Azure Active Directory can work with those to be able to detect compliance. But there are those capabilities, but the native features can't be beat, right? There's really not a whole lot you need to do. Turn it on, set up a compliance policy, and then leverage that in your conditional access policies, right? To allow or deny or block access to devices that fall out of compliance, if that's what you need to do in your particular environment. Securing access to apps, single sign-on, of course. If you're still running Active Directory Federation services, ADFS on-prem, this is a reminder, call to action, really to start migrating off of ADFS to Azure Active Directory. There's pretty much full parity now between what ADFS can do and Azure Active Directory can do from a sign-on perspective. Azure Active Directory now even supports certificate-based authentication. There is things you can do with securing the claims tokens now. Some new capabilities that just this past maybe a month or two ago were made available. You want to be able to streamline your users' access to their applications, right? Give them a nice portal, the My Apps portal, to be able to see all their applications, launch them from there, and have that really seamless single sign-on experience. For protecting sensitive data, this is where Microsoft Information Protection comes in. So being able to classify, label your documents. What you get in the E5 SKU with this is just more automation and the ability to run the scanner on your on-premise file shares and other on-premise repositories where you may have unstructured data and files, and be able to apply labels to those items as well, and then take that further by applying protection policies. Now, again, I think back to the more recent breach with the guardsmen up in Massachusetts, or I believe it's Massachusetts, with those documents, right? I'm thinking if they had a protection policy on those documents that, because they're top secret, that prevented being able to print them out, then perhaps that might have been a way to thwart that type of breach. But of course, there's plenty of other use cases for it. Being able to leverage those capabilities, which are part of your entitlement, and take advantage of it. So ultimately, what we get for the user is easy sign-on, flexible, secure options, and they really don't have to think about it, right? It's kind of set up on the back end, and they set up their mobile device, their Microsoft Authenticator, or if they're issued security keys to log in, or their laptops are equipped with Windows Hello, right? It's a seamless process. And all the while, all the way through, at the end, you're protecting your sensitive data from a breach. So finally, we'll take a look at reducing cyber risk with integrated best-in-class protection, what that looks like. For CISOs, this is a Forbes article that went into sort of the top priorities. It was top 5 priorities. I only added the 4. The first one was more regarding hiring. Of course, we know in cybersecurity, finding qualified staff, there's still a shortage. But the other 4 priorities here I thought were interesting because they lined up with the topic today. And one was the total cost of ownership focus on products. And essentially, it's saying that CISOs will need to prioritize the intelligent selection of cybersecurity products by considering the total cost of ownership. This includes the cost of deployment and operations, as well as the ongoing maintenance and support of that product. And so CISOs, by considering the TCO of those different products, they can make a more informed decision and choose products that will provide the best value for the organization. I thought that was interesting because it kind of lined up with this conversation. You have Microsoft 365 security, you have E5, you're kind of there. You have a an answer for here's my total cost of ownership, because it essentially comes in one SKU that where you're providing per head in the organization X amount of dollars are being spent, and you're getting all these capabilities. The second was improving threat prevention to combat cyber turbulence. And the talking point there was that CISOs are going to have to prioritize the improvement of their threat prevention practices, right? So it's really good to have a solution in place that can detect those threats, but once they're on the network, it's all of a sudden a fire drill, right? It's having to shut things down. It's having to you know isolate environments, and it's going to require some downtime. So priority here is going to be threat prevention, and some of the suggestions here were measures like advanced security technologies like API security solutions, XDR solutions, right? More advanced extended detection and response solutions, and cloud security tools. The third was its infrastructure optimization, essentially saying you have multi-cloud environment. Well, you now have just expanded your attack surface, and not saying that having multi-cloud is a bad thing, but you just have more to protect now. So understand what's out there, and that kind of goes back to that cloud security posture management that Defender for Cloud can provide. And so while Defender for Cloud itself is not part of an E5, I do bring that out because for right now, just the foundational cloud security posture management capabilities are still free. As of August 1st of this year, there will be, that free tier is going to go away. But if you haven't had a chance to look at Defender for Cloud, and if you have a multi-cloud environment, I want to see if your infrastructure as a service, your platform as a service solutions are compliant. If there's any vulnerabilities, you can take advantage of that, and then look at the cost of that as just integrating that into the overall solution. And then finally, it's embracing automation, right? We know security teams are already taxed as it is. There's just so many signals coming in. So top priority for CISOs is going to be embracing that automation. I'm going to skip ahead here and just kind of real quick, take a look at, this is kind of the typical landscape for a lot of organizations today. Best in class or best of breed products throughout. This particular attack kill chain, right? It's going to be a familiar one. The phishing email gets into the environment, works its way through the organization, compromises a user account. There's a lateral movement. These types of attack, on average, can take 200 days or so for the attacker to, do reconnaissance, get in the environment, live off the land, and then start to expand, right? Start to test what they have, wait for commands from a command and control server that's out there. And so, what we see is, these different security solutions that are required across that attack kill chain, but if there's very little orchestration between them, that's where you have these blind spots and these gaps, right? So let's take a look at how these different security controls protect email, endpoints, identities, and cloud resources, right? So first, here, the first thing is you have that email that arrives, and there might be some good integration between the endpoint detection solution, between the identity provider here, in this case it's Okta, But in other areas, right, there's poor integration. Let's say between the user behavioral analytics, the network firewall, um, the PAM solution, right? There's very little integration between those two. It may be inconsistent. Some are passing information well, others maybe require some manual intervention. The point is, the more point solutions you have across the kill chain, the more inconsistent the sharing of the information becomes, and that creates delays and a greater risk of a breach. The next challenge is how these different security solutions now are able to transmit those signals to your SIEM. In this case, the SIEM is Splunk. There's different solutions that can send stronger or weaker signals to that SIEM solution. Again, it's that inconsistency that puts your SecOps teams and their tooling at a disadvantage. And if they don't have the most accurate information, that can just lead to wasted effort, and the cost of that breach can, of course, be worse. Now, of course, we look at the Microsoft solution, and this is where, the Microsoft story is here about closing those gaps because of that tight integration between each of these, right? So here we've lined up the Microsoft security capabilities that all work in concert with one another across the attack kill chain. The approach here uses AI, uses automation to automatically detect these potential threats while being backed up by the vast scale and insights represented through the Microsoft cloud. Again, Microsoft receives trillions of signals a day, and they put those to work, right, in improving their products. So in this situation, the Microsoft Defender products, right, they're able to detect that phishing attempt. That kicks off an automated investigation that removes the malicious attachment, detonates the URLs before they reach the user's inbox. Defender, of course, can then, Defender here can, of course, with its integrated identity protection, endpoint protection, be able to do that detection across, or be able to detect if the account has been compromised. And if it has been compromised, because you have identity protection in place, require the user to either provide multi-factor authentication when they log in next time, or change their password. And then Sentinel, of course, while it's a separate product, not part of Microsoft 365 E5 entitlement, it's a Microsoft Cloud SIEM solution. There are, a lot of free ingestion that you can do into Microsoft. Microsoft has allowances for things like your Azure AD sign-in logs to be able to be ingested. Your Office 365 activity can be ingested into Sentinel for free. There's no additional cost to do that. We've had a few cases where customers were using Splunk. They were happy with Splunk. They weren't looking to replace it, but they were looking to offset some of those costs. So they started to move some of those signals over into Sentinel, where they didn't have to pay, and let Splunk continue to be the downstream solution. So that's one approach you can take with this. The point of all this, of course, is that you get that tighter integration between each of those products, and just reduces, those gaps between each of them. And that's where, Microsoft 365 Defender comes in, right? Has that cross-domain security. Let's skip ahead here. Just take a look at again. So in our example, you have phishing emails, Defender for Office 365. That's where that comes in. Again, if you have E5, you have that Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. You're protected against phishing, zero-day malware, malicious links in email, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and Office applications. You get a visibility across the entire organization. And one feature that's probably not taken advantage of is the real-world phishing and training simulation. There is an attack training simulation engine as part of Defender for Office 365. So if you're using a third-party tool for training of end users to be able to detect phishing emails, this is one area that you may already own another product that does a pretty good job. At Oxford, we use this consistently. We use it once a quarter. We send out attack training simulation emails to our users, just to ensure that they're up to speed and how to detect and be able to notice when emails are trying to do credential harvest or plant malicious malware into the environment. That's one key area that you may want to take a look at. Endpoint protection, of course, is going to be Defender for Endpoint, it's an advanced EDR, XDR solution. So, if you're running a third party, Trend Micro, McAfee, CrowdStrike, any of these solutions, you can still run Defender in parallel. Defender will just take a passive approach, but it still allows you to be able to collect information and send those up to services like Defender for Cloud Apps, for instance, right, to be able to get visibility onto the device. Identity protection. This is another feature we see with a lot of our customers that's not being taken advantage of. The identity protection, it's essentially very easy to just turn on. It's two policies: user sign-in risk and user risk. So sign-in risk and user risk that can detect things like impossible travel, abnormal user behavior, signing on at weird hours when users usually are not signing in. And we see a lot of organizations not really taking advantage of that and leveraging that into their conditional access policies, right, for a risk-based conditional access approach. That's where Cloud App Protection, Defender for Cloud Apps comes in, right? So leveraging Defender for Cloud Apps, expanding that out to beyond just Office 365. There's a whole list of solutions now that can integrate with Defender for Cloud Apps, that have APIs. AWS, Salesforce, ServiceNow are just a few that could think off the top of my head, but there's a much longer list than just a few years ago that you can integrate. There's a session proxy, an application proxy you can leverage to further protect your information and prevent data loss. The Defender for Cloud Apps integrates nicely with the DLP engine that's kind of built into information protection, so you can create policies to prevent data exfiltration or downloading of sensitive information onto unmanaged devices, right? These are just some of the possibilities when you leverage Defender for Cloud Apps. So these are some of my, what I call the E5 low-hanging fruit, that my recommendation, so as a takeaway today. Identity protection, risk-based conditional access, right? That's part of that Azure AD Premium P2 SKU, which is in E5. Take a look at that. Start if you haven't already. Enabling that functionality. It can be scoped, right? So it doesn't have to be the entire organization. It can be scoped to just certain individuals if you wanted to kick the tires on it. But highly recommend that. PIM, again, so PIM is sort of privileged access management in the cloud. Essentially, reduce the number of global administrators that you have provisioned now to less than 5, and use PIM for all the other roles in Azure Active Directory that people may need elevation to, right? But you don't have to keep them permanently entitled to those privileged roles, which of course, if those accounts are breached, could be disastrous, right? Somebody with a global admin account is compromised, that could be really disastrous. Access reviews, right? So access reviews, again, part of that Azure AD P2 SKU, but you can start using this for guest accounts. If you're leveraging Azure AD B2B to allow guests into your organization, but now you've seen this proliferation of guest accounts everywhere in your Azure Active Directory, and you don't know should they still be there, you can leverage access reviews to do that. To send out these reviews to the parties responsible and just say a determination: does this person still need access, right? And do those on a regular cadence. I mentioned Defender for Cloud Apps already, right? So leveraging that, start off with just connecting Office 365, but then perhaps expanding it to your third-party cloud applications as well. And then that attack simulation training that I mentioned, which is part of that Defender for Office 365 plan too, which we see many are not taking advantage of. They have third-party solutions for that. Next steps for everybody. So as a Microsoft partner, we run on request security workshops. There is a security secure identities and access workshop that we run regularly with customers, again, on request. It's basically a commitment, a time commitment of about 24 to 25 hours that can be spread over the course of a couple weeks if desired. But that'll essentially kind of give you a plan, right? So how to deploy some of these workloads in your environment. Help you to, what do I prioritize? I have applications. What can I prioritize? I have these other, I have MFA, but I don't have it rolled out to everybody. How can I get that rolled out to everybody, right? These are some of the things that we can cover in these workshops. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to us. We can see if you're eligible. Again, it's a time commitment. These are no costs to you as a customer. There's just an eligibility requirement, so we just have to look that up. But if you're eligible, we can talk about deploying those. These are, what some of those workshops cover. The one we do the most is secure identities and access, but there are a few others that we can cover as well. And that's the time for today. Appreciate everybody's attendance.